psychology department. And I'll let my partner introduce herself as well.
Hi, my name is Lola. I'm also a peer advisor and I'm a senior. And yeah, go ahead.
And we're super excited to present Professor Courtney Bonam, uh, who's going to be talking to us about her lab and her research opportunities. So I'll hand it off.
Cool, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'd like to just talk with you all a little bit about me. So I'll share a little bit about my broad research interests, and then some of the motivation behind my work, my path to research in the PhD. I'll talk maybe a little bit about becoming a professor, and then I'll share some of the specifics of my research, my program of research with you too, as much as we have time for, because I know we want to leave time for Q&A as well. And for the organizers of this event, can you tell me what time should I transition to Q&A? So I can just have that in mind as I'm talking.
I would say I say we can leave maybe 10, 15 minutes for Q&A, so we can aim for maybe 2:45 perhaps or 2:50.
Okay. I'll aim for 2:45 so we can have more time for Q&A, or maybe even 2:40. We'll see. Okay, so so just broadly, my research, and when I talk about my research interests, I'll also share a little bit about like what undergraduate research assistants usually do in my lab as well. So broadly, my research focuses on racial stereotyping processes. I'm really interested in how people think about racial groups in general and then apply those generalizations to judgments and decisions they make about specific group members. One application of this kind of process question that I'm also really interested in is thinking about how people racialize physical space. So a lot of my work looks at how people actually hold stereotypes in their heads or like images in their heads of spaces like neighborhoods or houses, other buildings, or like geographic locations based on their racial demographics. And so then I ask what kinds of generalizations do people make about places based on the racial association they make with it, and how do they value the place and maybe treat the space accordingly, depending on those racialized like stereotypes focused on the place. So usually we don't think about stereotyping places. Usually we just think about stereotyping people. So I think that it's just interesting to think about like how we can stereotype things other than people, like how race gets mapped onto things other than people. So that's one broad interest I have. I'm also interested in how those processes can reinforce different forms of racial inequality, like environmental racism and climate injustices. So that's one direction that my work is going in now. And then I'm also interested in multiracial people, so multiracial people's experiences, how multiracial people navigate their own identity and then also form community with each other and with their component racial groups. So that's like another line of my research. And I think both lines of work, I'm like motivated to study both of these broad research questions because I think that like thinking about these two different research questions can highlight how race really is a social construct. It's socially derived. People came up with this system for classifying people. It's not something that just exists naturally out there in the world. It's not a biological concept. It's actually like a social construct. So I think those two research questions broadly kind of highlight that insight. So that's one of the main motivations behind the work that I do. So undergraduates who are research assistants in my lab are involved in both lines of this work. Usually research assistants in my lab I try to involve them in all different aspects of the research process. So from like developing study materials to collecting data, to thinking about how to analyze the data and interpret findings. And then RAs will also, RA stands for Research Assistant. So RAs will also help with writing up findings as well. So more specifically, like what does this look like? So for some of the work that I'm doing, a lot of the work that I do actually involves collecting data through online surveys. So research assistants might help write questions that would go in an online survey that would be, you know, asking people about their thoughts about physical spaces and the racial associations they make with them. Research assistants might also work with my PhD students to help refine materials in that way as well. So for example, one of my PhD students, Ashley, she's getting ready to collect data in the like race and space line of research that I just described. She created an online survey, and then research assistants in our lab read the survey that she created and gave her feedback on the questions that she had in there and like the flow of questions. So like the order that she was asking people questions in to help like make the survey just make more sense to participants to help make sure that participants were going to understand like the flow of everything and the question wording. So research assistants are involved like in that. That's one example of how research assistants might be involved in actually creating study materials. And then with data collection, a lot of the work that I'm doing now is like I mentioned, online surveys. So there really isn't a lot to do for data collection there because it's kind of an automated process. But some of the work that I do involves in-person data collection. So for example, I have another project in my lab going on right now that is asking, the goal of the project is to talk with mixed college students about their experiences on campus. And I'm working with members of the Mixed College Student Association here on campus, MAXA, to run focus groups where the two of the leaders of MEXA and I facilitate a conversation with college students on campus who identify as mixed to, you know, just talk with them about what their experiences are and think about whether or not there are any additional resources the university could provide to support their transition from high school to college and also just, you know, create a more kind of like a stronger community of mixed people on campus. So that's so, you know, actually facilitating focus groups and talking with participants about like the research question that we're interested in investigating. That's another example of how research assistants might be involved in my lab. So they might actually help with in-person data collection. So I just described focus groups as one method for data collection, but another method for data collection in my lab is running experiments, like actually in my lab rooms in social sciences too, where participants come into my lab and they sit at a computer and take a survey on a computer. And when I run experiments like that, then participants they can't administer the study to themselves. They need a researcher there to like guide them through the process. So I'll often ask undergraduate research assistants to help with data collection. So to be the experimenter who meets the participant in the lab room, gives them instructions about what they need to do, and then like has a debriefing conversation with them at the end of the data collection period. So that's just another way that research assistants might be involved in data collection in my lab. And then, you know, I mentioned being involved in all steps of the research process. So another big task that research assistants in my lab will do is helping out with literature searches. So that means doing searches for related articles to the research topics I just described within PsycInfo, and then sharing those articles with me and the grad students in my lab along with like a short summary of what the articles did, what the researchers, like the authors of the articles did and found with the research they're reporting in those articles. And then we also think about how those findings are relevant to the ongoing projects we have in the lab. So what I'm describing now is like an annotated bibliography. So research assistants in my lab will help with finding relevant articles, so doing literature searches and then writing annotated bibliographies based on those literature searches so that myself and my graduate students and the undergrad RAs so that we can make sure that we're up on the most recent relevant research findings to help support like our thinking about the research questions we're investigating. And then for thinking about analyzing data, RAs in my lab will often they won't often analyze data on their own that we've collected, but we'll have lab meetings where the undergrad RAs in my lab attend the lab meetings and my PhD students attend a lab meeting all together, and we'll talk about the kinds of analyses we're doing on like data that we've collected recently. And I might do like a demo where I show undergrad RAs how to do a certain type of analysis. And like, we'll look at the findings together. So like the output from quantitative analyses, and we'll talk about how to interpret those analyses. So usually undergrad RAs aren't doing independent data analyses in my lab, but we'll have meetings where we talk together about analyses for ongoing projects so that RAs kind of get exposed to the different findings and how to interpret them that are ongoing in the lab. So I think that's all I'll say for now about like different roles or tasks that RAs might do in my lab, but I'm happy to talk about your questions and more specifics a little bit later on too. So now what I want to do is just talk a little bit about my path to research and the PhD and becoming a professor. So, because I think it's important to share this path as well, especially if I'm assuming all of you are interested in doing research and potentially even having a career in research. One way to have a career in research is to become a professor. So I'll talk a little bit about my path in case anybody's interested in maybe trying to continue on a similar path. So when I was in undergrad, I was a psychology major, but I actually started out as an English major. I didn't know I wanted to study psychology when I first got to undergrad. And then it wasn't until I took my intro to psychology course and learned about social psychology and this concept called stereotype threat that I thought to myself, oh, wow, I can actually study racial dynamics with psychology, which is something that I've always been interested in my whole life. And I just realized like, oh, like I can become an expert in this area of life that I've always felt passionate about. And so once I learned about how social psychologists study like racial stereotyping, concepts like stereotype threat, which I'm happy to talk about more in Q&A if anyone's interested. I realized like, oh, this is a field that I can really use to pursue this topic that I'm passionate about. Around the same time, I also started taking some statistics courses, and people kept advising me, like graduate students, like the TAs for my classes, they kept advising me, like, if you want to go into psychology, you really need to get a graduate degree, and if you want to use your degree in your profession in the future. And so I kind of had it in my head that I wanted to get a master's. I didn't really understand what the PhD was yet at that point. And so people were also telling me if you want to go to graduate school, it's good to have a background in statistics, in like quantitative analysis. And so I started taking more stats classes so that I could have more of a background in like statistical analysis. And when I did that, I actually really started getting interested in research from, just the combination of like knowing that psychologists can study the things I was really interested in, and then also having a better understanding of statistics and how people can like analyze data that they collect on these topics that I was really interested in. So I the more I learned about those two fields, both psychology and statistics, the more I thought to myself, oh, yeah, I can see myself really having a career in research. I really want to continue being able to do research. And so at that point, I decided that I think that I made that transition or realization probably sometime during the end of my sophomore year, my second year of college. And at that point, I decided I wanted to do an honors thesis. And here at Santa Cruz, we call it a senior thesis. So that's just like an independent research project where I developed my own research question, I collected my own data, and then I wrote a research report on that project that I did. And I had like really great mentors who supported me through that process and encouraged me to continue on. Without that great mentoring, I don't know that I would have become a professor. So, and then as I worked on my thesis, I, just solidified my interest in doing research and decided I wanted to pursue a PhD. And I don't think I would have known that a PhD was an option for me if it weren't for my uncle, who's no other people in my family hadn't gotten their PhD, but my uncle had gone to law school. And so I think he had more interactions with people who had gotten their PhD. And he had let me know that actually when you get a PhD, you don't have to pay. Usually, you don't have to pay to get your PhD. You get paid to get a PhD. And that really made me think, oh, yeah, okay, maybe this is feasible. Because he explained that when you get a master's thesis, you have to pay tuition to get a master's thesis. But when you're getting a PhD, usually you do teaching to support yourself through the degree that covers your tuition. The teaching you do as a teaching assistant covers your tuition, and then you also get a very modest stipend for doing that work as well. So you don't get paid a lot of money, but I didn't end up having to go into debt, or take out loans to pursue a PhD because I was getting paid to do that. So I think that's an important like realization to make about the process if graduate school is something you're interested in. Um, so yeah, so I had great mentors who encouraged me to continue on with the research process, and I realized that the PhD was going to be feasible for me too, like just financially. Um, and then toward the end of my undergraduate career, so when I was a senior, I started applying to PhD programs. And during Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions like about the nitty-gritty of that process and what it was like if anyone wants to know more about it. But it is definitely a process. It's an undertaking. There's a lot of work involved in applying to PhD programs. So it took up a lot of my time senior year. And I think that looking back on it, if I could do it again, I would have taken a year off in between graduating and applying to PhD programs because it was just a lot to do all at once, especially while I was doing my senior thesis as well. So taking time off is definitely a good thing, I think. And eventually I got into a PhD program. I studied social psychology. And after I finished my degree, I became a professor. My first job was at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And at that school, I was in the social psychology area, but there was also a community psychology area at that school. And through connecting with my colleagues in community psychology, I got interested in taking and doing research from like a multi-method perspective. So I mentioned in undergrad, I got really interested in statistics and like quantitative psychology. When I started my first faculty position and connected with people in community psychology, I realized that there's this whole other world of like qualitative research methods that I really hadn't learned a lot about up to that point. And so I started taking like a slightly different approach to thinking about research through those connections with my colleagues there. And I think that at Santa Cruz, the social area, which I'm a part of at Santa Cruz, which I joined in 2018, so I've been here for about 6 years now. Yeah, when I came here, I realized like my colleagues at Santa Cruz also have that emphasis. So kind of like a multi-method emphasis. People often try to combine quantitative and qualitative methods in the work that they do. And that's the kind of orientation that my lab has as well. So I think I'll leave it there in terms of talking about my path um, to becoming a professor and like doing research and pursuing a PhD, but I'm happy to answer more questions in Q&A if anything popped up. Um, and I will talk. So, keeping that in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit more about my research specifically now, but just keep in mind as I'm talking, I'm going to focus more on some of my quantitative work. But in my lab, we really combine both quantitative and qualitative work. And I also try to do work that's like participatory in nature. So where community members are also helping to devise research questions and like think about how to investigate research questions as well. That's definitely the orientation that the mixed student project I just described earlier has. But right now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my work that's not really participatory in nature and it's more quantitative in nature. It's experimental. Okay, so I'm gonna transition now to just sharing a little bit more of the like theoretical background behind the work that I do, and then I'll share at least one study with you all, and then we'll see how much time is left. If I have more time, I'll share 2 studies. We'll see. Okay, so a lot of the work that I do, I mentioned, focuses on race and space. So I like to frame some of the work I do in terms of thinking about racial bias both in the mind and on the ground, like in the world around us, how it gets translated to the world around us. And this work also focuses on like environmental inequality as well. So when I say physical space, I'm referring to just any element of our built or natural environment, or even like geographical areas, for example, houses, rivers, neighborhoods, or nations. And then what I also really try to emphasize when I talk about this work is this idea that race and space are inextricably tied together. And in many ways, race is because space functions as a tool for creating and maintaining both racial group boundaries and racial hierarchy. So for example, from the time race has been used as a method of classifying people, certain races have been associated with certain spaces. And then from the time, also this intertwining of race and space occurs on a smaller scale. So in the US, for example, during Jim Crow, physical space was used as a tool to separate Black Americans and white Americans. And then not only were Black spaces like literally labeled as Black spaces during these historical periods, they were also under-resourced and physically degraded. And then, oops, sorry. New Deal public housing policy and redlining practices explicitly and intentionally steered Black families into neighborhoods that were at best undesirable and at worst toxically hazardous. So this historical grounding of race and space has left us in the US and really globally too, but in different ways. It's left us with a legacy of place-relevant racial disparities today. So for example, there's a gap in housing values. So when you match Black and white households for class, there's a property value gap of the homes that they own of about $25,000. So Black homes are worth less than white homes. That's the general trend. And then it's also the case that Black Americans are about 79% more likely than white Americans to live in an area where the greatest health risk is posed by industrial pollution. And there's actually a report that was commissioned by the United Church of Christ in 2007, and they did a follow-up report, originally in 1987, and then they did a follow-up report in 2007. Both reports showed that minority and low socioeconomic status communities are more likely to experience these burdens than white affluent communities. And one of the one really important point of these reports is that you can't just explain away the racial disparities when you account for class status. So race actually was the largest predictor of these disparities in exposure to pollution when you accounted for class. Uh, and so that was like a stable pattern across 20 years. And there's also, newer research looking at disparities in exposure to industrial pollution, showing that this trend of like of race disparities at like almost virtually every class level and exposure to like industrial pollution. So like, like unclean air, for example, due to industrial pollution that exists, those racial disparities exist at virtually like every class level. So this is a really like robust pattern, unfortunately. Um, and I think an important question lingers. So why haven't we made more progress on reducing these disparities, especially when considering the fact that we have laws and policies intended to govern material life in the United States? So you can see here I have on the screen a quote from Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. No person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And then also you can think about the mission of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Its mission is, this is what's on their website. It's to protect human health and the environment. So the purpose here is to ensure that all Americans are protected from significant risks to human health and the environment where they live, learn, and work. So, you can ask yourself again, like, why haven't we made more progress given these values that we're expressing in our, government mission and in our, very important government documents, the Civil Rights Act? Why haven't we made more progress toward reducing these place-based racial disparities? So the fact that we haven't made more progress, it's also striking because we actually do know a great deal about how our interactions with physical space contribute to these disparities. So I already kind of described how some work has shown that it's race as a like demographic factor beyond class can predict these disparities. Um, Robert Bullard, who is a sociology professor and one of the authors of the Toxic Waste and Race report that I was mentioning, the 87 and 2007 reports. He's known as the father of the environmental justice movement. He argues that race really is the single most important factor beyond class predicting racial differences in pollution exposure. And in much of his writing, he talks about how race operates to maintain these disparities through explicit racial bias. So people's like outward negative attitudes toward racial minorities, and environmental policies that have a greater negative impact on poor communities of color. But I see my work as contributing to this very impactful work by using a psychological approach to think about maybe more subtle and hidden forms of racial biases that could also characterize another way that race contributes to these disparities, maybe in a way that hasn't been fully captured by the conversation that I just described, like that Robert Bullard, for example, is driving forward, and other colleagues in sociology and environmental studies. So the work that I'm talking about that I'm doing, it shows that space really isn't only structurally racialized as evidenced by like persistent racial residential segregation in the housing and environmental racial disparities that I just described, but that it's also psychologically racialized. So that means that people can easily racially categorize physical spaces, and that people make generalizations about the qualities that they believe define Black and white spaces in the United States. So my work shows that people actually really do racially categorize physical space. Um, and it shows that people hold pictures in their heads of what qualities generally characterize Black space and what qualities generally characterize white space. So you can see here, these are some of the characteristics that participants in my studies list when I ask them to describe areas that they associate with the places that Black Americans live. So from rundown, impoverished, dirty, all the way to ghetto. And then when I ask people to answer the same question, but for places they associate with white Americans, where white Americans live, they'll mention these other characteristics. So it's like polar opposites, well-resourced, clean, green space, suburban, all the way down to quiet. Um, so I think there's a lot more about these patterns I could say, but um, and if you all have questions, like I've done various follow-up studies to kind of understand more about the way that people think about these patterns or the way that people hold these stereotypes in their heads, and also like what demographic groups show these same patterns within the US. Most of my work invites white people to participate in these studies and answer these kinds of questions, but I've also done some work with Latin Americans and Black Americans, seeing if they follow the same patterns that you see here on the screen. So I can answer questions about that in Q&A too, if you'd like. So these are, but generally speaking, though, these are some of the images that people hold in their heads about Black space and white space. So I'm going to skip ahead and talk with you all about, just share with you all like one study that I've done that kind of follows up on these images and asks like, how might these images be affecting the judgments people make about specific neighborhoods? So one study I've done looks at one study I've done looks at like industrial pollution, so people's willingness to pollute areas based on the area's racial demographics. So in this study, my collaborators and I recruited a nationally representative sample of about 400 white Americans to participate in an online study, and they had to read like a scenario where a community was being faced with potentially having a chemical plant built near their neighborhood. So they had to read about like a proposal to build a chemical plant and provide their opinions about whether or not they thought the chemical plant should actually be built. So in this scenario, participants read, they were given some information about like the neighborhood that was near the proposed site for the chemical plant. So they read some like information about the environment in the area, the demographics of the area, and then also housing in the area, including like class information. Like so, for example, the median home cost. And then in this study, this was an experiment. So my collaborators and I manipulated what participants saw when they read about the largest ethnic population. So half of the participants in this study were randomly assigned to think that the largest ethnic population in the nearby community was white, and the other half of participants were randomly assigned to think that the largest ethnic population in the nearby community was African American or Black. And then we also manipulated the housing cost information that participants in this study saw. So half of the participants actually saw that the median home cost was $200,000, which people interpreted as being like about middle class. And then the other half of our participants did not get that information. And when participants didn't get that information, they assumed that the neighborhood was like working class, so like a little bit lower than middle class. And then I'm not going to talk in detail about the effect of this class manipulation just because of time, but I'm happy to answer questions about it during Q&A. And then What I will tell you about quickly, though, is just the effect of that. Oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. What I will tell you quickly about, though, is the effect of this race manipulation on participants' um, opposition to building the chemical plant, um, on their stereotyping of the space. So, like in this case, the extent to which they assumed that the nearby area was already industrial, like the extent to which they assumed there's already existing chemical plants or power plants there. And then also the extent to which they wanted to like connect with the space. So how much would they want to live there, or just how connected that did they report feeling to the space? So what we found, as we expected, what we found is that participants were less opposed to building the chemical plant when the neighborhood was mostly Black compared to mostly white. Um, they also assumed that the neighborhood was going to be more industrial when it was mostly Black versus white, going beyond the information they were given. And then they also reported feeling less connected to the Black neighborhood compared to the white neighborhood. And what we found is that actually these factors were all related to each other. So when participants saw a Black compared to a white neighborhood, they that led people to assume the Black neighborhood was more industrial. And then that assumption about the neighborhood being more industrial is what made people feel less connected to the Black neighborhood. And ultimately, that sense of depressed connection to the Black neighborhood is what explained why they were less opposed to building a chemical plant in the Black neighborhood. Um, so I think these findings are important because they show that race can spread beyond people. It can get mapped onto physical spaces. Spaces can be racially stereotyped, and really what's not required is negative thoughts about people at all, or thinking you will live in the target locale. Participants weren't thinking they were going to be living in this space. It was just some space they were disconnected from, and they still were devaluing the Black neighborhood. Okay, it's 2:44, so I'm gonna leave it there. I could talk, during Q&A, I can talk more about implications of this work if anyone's interested in like some follow-up analyses we did with the class manipulation we had too. But I just wanted to share that study to just give you all more of a flavor of the kind of methods we use and some of the concrete research that we're doing in the lab. So ongoing projects we have use similar methods to what I just described. Okay, I'll leave it there and we can open it up for Q&A. Thanks everybody for your attention.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time. I was going to say we had a couple questions prepared, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat and I can read those off as well. But yeah, I can pull up the questions we have prepared. Let's see. Are you accepting any RAs for this upcoming winter quarter? And what do you look for when you pick RAs for your lab? I suppose is the first one.
Yeah. Yes, we will have open positions starting winter quarter. And there, if you go to my lab website, which I can drop in the chat if people don't have it already. You'll see an application. So we ask we ask prospective research assistants to fill out the application that's linked on our website. In that application, it has all the things we consider as we're thinking about who to invite to be a part of lab. One of the most important things is experience with the kind of research questions we're asking. So experience thinking about racial dynamics from a psychological perspective, and also like an interdisciplinary perspective too. So thinking about these questions from the perspective of like related social science fields like critical race and ethnic studies, which is a department that I'm also affiliated with, or community studies, sociology, anthropology. So if you've taken classes that are relevant in any of those fields, and including psychology, that would definitely be a plus. But we don't require having taken classes on related topics. If you can talk about how your lived experience informs your insight into and interest in related questions, then that we would also count that as like experience related to, or experience that would prepare you for being a research assistant in my lab. And then it also helps if you have research experience too, like so for example, if you've taken Psych 100, so research methods in psychology, or if you've had research experience in some other way, like by participating in another faculty member's lab or participating in research in just any other class you've taken or in like a faculty member's lab in another department. Um, but that is not required. So that's not like an absolute requirement. So we don't like having taken Psych 100 is not a prereq, for example, for becoming an undergraduate research assistant in our lab. So I always encourage people to just apply, even if you don't have research experience. And oftentimes, when people apply, they're not able to get into a position the first time they apply because we just have such like a small number of positions available. But it helps to be persistent. So definitely, like stay in touch with me if you're not able to get into a position the first time you apply, and like be persistent and staying in touch with me. And my hope is that eventually you'll get a position. But I can't always guarantee that that will happen just because there seems to be many more interested students than there are positions available, which is something that I want to think about how to like change that. How can I create more space for working with undergraduate research assistants? But that's something I'll have to think about more and solve later on. But we will have open positions next quarter, so I encourage you to apply if you're interested.
Cool. That was actually the following question was how many positions are open? And also
Mhm.
they were asking about if they still have to email you before sending out the application, if that's still necessary, because now we already know there's going to be some open spots.
You don't have to email me first before applying. You can just go ahead and apply. And well, I'm not sure yet how many open positions there will be. I would say probably at least three. But I'm not sure yet because week 8 of the quarter, which we're in now, is usually when I check in with my grad students about like, thinking ahead to next quarter, what are the projects we're going to be working on, and like how many research assistants will we need to carry out those projects. So we'll be having those conversations like, this week and early next week to figure that out.
All right, and then the next question was, when would we know if we were chosen for the position?
So we should get back to you in a couple weeks. So we're in week 8 now. So sometime during like finals week, we'll get back to people um, to let them know if they're still being considered or if we want to like chat more before making a final decision.
And then the next question was, are the applications first come, first serve, or are they based on qualification?
Definitely based on qualifications. And so, we really think about like how much experience and interest do people have? How much do people's interests align with the projects that we're working on in the lab? And how much experience, either lived experience or like classroom experience, do people have in that area? Those are the two most important things. And then another important factor too is like persistence. So if I know that students have applied multiple times to be in the lab and they have alignment with their interests and the interests of the lab, then those people would get priority.
And then the next one was, are there any new projects you guys are expecting to work on during the winter, springtime, or is it building off previous work?
Both. So all the new projects we start build on previous work. All the projects we're doing are related to one of those two lines of work that I just described. But we will be starting new projects, but all within those two lines of work that I just described. So multiracial identity and community, or like race and space. So like stereotyping spaces and how do those stereotypes reinforce different forms of racial inequality? I also of my grad, I will say two of my grad students are working on developing their dissertations. one person is interested in racial trauma and how society broadly either does or does not acknowledge racial trauma for Black people and how Black people cope with that. And then my other PhD student is interested in how Black women are treated within the criminal justice system. There's a more specific lens to that question, but just broadly, that's what she's interested in. And so we'll be getting some work started in those areas as well. I'm not the one driving those forward, so I kind of forgot to mention those, but actually, yeah, we do have interest in those areas as well. I'm not sure if we'll need research assistants to help with those projects next quarter, though. But those are two other projects that are on the horizon for us.
And then the next one is more directed about participating in a PhD program and how you would go about doing that. So the question is, how did you go about researching a university slash professor to work with, and how many places did you apply to, and any other further details about the process you think we should know?
Yeah, I applied to 13 different schools. Because which feels like it felt like a lot to me at the time, but I was advised to apply to that many because it's very competitive. And I definitely didn't get into every school I applied to. And I figured out, so I decided on schools to apply to based on the faculty in the programs. So I just kind of had the orientation of I'm not really applying to a school, I'm applying to work with a particular faculty member. And I looked up the faculty to like apply to work with based on research articles I had read. So the articles that I was like most interested in. I looked up the authors of those articles and where they were faculty. And that's kind of how I decided to apply to the programs I applied to. So really like it's important to read research, like read published research in your area of interest and see like who's publishing in that area and use that as a guide for thinking about what programs to apply to. I also talked with my mentors, so the faculty member and the graduate student who were advising me on my senior thesis research. They gave me advice about who to consider as well. So like, they were doing work in the area I was interested in going to grad school for. And so they knew other people who were also doing work in that area at other schools. They were able to give me suggestions for who to look into applying with as well. And I think that like those connections that your mentors have with people you're applying with, they matter a lot. um, and that can actually help you get into grad school too, if your mentors are like contacting the people who you're applying to work with and saying like, hey, I have this great student who's applying to grad school this year. You should take a look at their application. Like that is very helpful. So if you have mentors who can do that for you, that's a great thing. I think there was another question embedded in that question that I might have skipped over.
In the question regarding the PhD
Hmm.
program.
Did I answer that?
Uh, no, yeah, I think you got all of it.
Okay, cool.
Um, the, I'm sorry. The next big one was there are undergrad courses for cognitive and developmental psych, but none for social psych. What courses would you suggest here at UCC that would give students a better baseline understanding of social psychology?
I know, isn't that? I don't like the implicit message that sends that we don't really offer regularly intro to social psych. But the reason why we don't as a social area is because we really don't, we, so for all of the more advanced courses that fall within social psychology, we really don't require students to have taken intro to social psychology. And I think we all really enjoy teaching in our like specific topic area. So we offer courses that are kind of more specifically like niche courses that relate more closely to what we're researching as faculty, which can actually be really great for students to be able to take a class from a faculty member like on the research that's like very related to the research that they're doing. So for example, teach a class on stereotyping, prejudice, and racism. I will be teaching, I'm not teaching it this year, but I'm teaching it in the summer. So that's one option. There are courses on like the psychology of liberation and oppression, like gender and sexuality. Um, I don't know. I don't have the whole set of classes listed in my head now, but I think talking with the peer advisors and the psychology major advisors would be great to do if you want to get like a list. Just have them help you generate a list of classes that fall within the social area because there definitely are a number of them, even though we don't regularly offer just like the broader intro to social class. There are definitely lots of classes that will give you more of an understanding of social psychology in general, especially with the lens of social psychology and social justice. All of the classes we offer have like a social justice lens to them as well.
And then the final one, just really quickly, was if we want to apply to a specific grad student's lab, do we have to specify that in our application, or are we just applying to your lab as a whole?
Yeah, you'd be applying to my lab as a whole. And then we'd ask, so like it's not the graduate students don't have their own labs. They might be working on a specific project, but the labs are led by faculty members, or like the labs or research groups are led by faculty members. So when research assistants apply to my lab, when I first invite them to actually become a member of lab, I have a conversation with them about what projects they're most interested in working on. And I try to pair them up with a grad student whose interests most closely align with theirs, but that it's not always possible for the undergraduate research assistant to be able to select like which graduate student they want to work with. It kind of just depends on like what positions are available and who needs the most help from research assistants at that time. So it's important to have like a broad interest in like all the things that we're studying. Um, if you're really serious about joining the lab, because we might ask you to work on like any of the projects that we're currently conducting.
And then I realized also very briefly that I missed one of the questions. It was just, is there a deadline for the apps for next quarter, or is it kind of a rolling basis?
We will start looking at applications sometime during week 9. So I'd say apply by the end of week 9 if you want to be considered for winter quarter. But we do, and then we usually like look at applications around week 8, 9 each quarter. So if you don't make it for this quarter, you can still apply, but we probably won't like look at your application until the end of winter quarter, like week 8 or 9 or so. But yeah, so apply by the end of week 9 to be for full consideration for winter quarter.
Cool, cool. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to all of us today.
Yeah, thanks for
Um,
inviting me. It was good to share and good to see everybody in the Zoom.
yeah. And then I was just gonna say what was posted on the screen there a second ago was a QR code that takes you to the general list of like research opportunities that are posted by the psychology department. So that's also a super useful tool to see all of the open labs, not just Professor Bonham's, but all the labs that are looking for RAs for this upcoming quarter. All right. Cool. Well, if there's nothing else, I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so
All right.
much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.